Hey, thanks for stopping by at Twisted Art Designs. I'm Lori from Goodyear, Arizona, and today I just want to talk about stencils. I know that there are lots and lots of videos on YouTube that show how to use a stencil, and I just want to show you a couple of fun and different ways that maybe you haven't seen. So let's get started. I love stencils. I use them in just about every page that I do in one way or another. First thing that I do when I get a stencil is I find which is the front and which is the back. Maybe you haven't heard about that, but I mark the corner with a Sharpie that says F for front, so I know which side is the front. Stencils, when they're laser cut or they're punched out, they have a flat side that is completely flat with no beveled edge, and on the front side there's a little tiny beveled edge. Sometimes it's hard to see just by looking at it. You can sometimes feel it with your fingernail. If you feel it and you feel an edge on this side but you don't feel an edge on this side, then smooth side is the back, beveled side is the front. Reason for that would be is when they sit down on your paper, that beveled flat side down to your paper is going to help you to keep your paints and spray inks and liquid items that you're putting through your stencil from leaking underneath, because you get a better, tighter seal to your paper. If that doesn't matter to you, just use your stencils willy-nilly. It's completely preference. But for me, I want that tight seal. I want a good, crisp, clean image when I do stuff with my stencils. So I mark them front. I figure out which is the beveled side, which is the smooth side, and I mark them with an F. And I used to mark them with a dot, but then when you'd flip it over, you could still see the dot through, and you still would figure out, well, which side did I make the dot? F, obviously, if it's upside down, it's going to be backwards. So F is front, and that's what I do. Okay, so that being said, I also keep my stencils clean. I've seen a lot of people who make art, and they don't care about their stencils. They don't wash their stencils. They don't clean their stencils as they go along. They just let them dry and keep using them. Well, common sense would be the paint, the inks, all that stuff that builds up is going to keep you from getting that good, clean, crisp edge. If that doesn't bother you and you don't care if it's just the grunge look, but you're just kind of getting a pattern, then don't clean your stencils. But for me, I keep my stencils clean because to me, if I take care of my art supplies, I make nicer, crisper art. So that's just me. Okay, so here's a stencil that I'm going to use on this art journal page, and I like the diamonds, and I'm sure you've seen a million times that with stencils you can apply paint, inks, chalks, pastels, distress inks, anything you want basically over the top. You can use a palette knife and your texture paste to make a raised image. You've seen that a million times already, so I'm not going to show that here. I'm going to show something a little bit different. Okay, so this is going to be layering, and it's not layering in the way that you might think, oh, I know exactly what she means, but maybe not. So the first thing I'm going to do is put down a layer of color with my stencil down on the page. Okay, so I put some paint down on a old catalog that I'm recycling as a palette. I'm just going to use some acrylic paint and a rounded cosmetic sponge. You've seen this a million times. I'm just going to put a background layer because I want those diamonds to have color in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and fill these diamonds in with paint just like that. Okay, and one of the reasons I love using a rounded cosmetic sponge is, if you can see, it adds some texture, so it already looks textured. So now what I'm going to do is remove my stencil, and I'm going to go and wash my stencil. And as you can see, I didn't get a good crisp image, even though I gave you my spiel about using the front side of the stencil, but that was my fault. For having this underneath my camera, I've got my arms really stretched out far to keep it in frame, and I'm going really fast for the sake of the length of the video, and I moved my stencil a little bit and I lifted it up while I was doing it instead of pressing it all the way down to the paper. So it doesn't matter because I'm going to fix that. I can fix that at the end on this art journal page. But just for the sake of the technique, I'm going to put that stencil back over the top. and move on to the next thing. Okay, so for the next thing, I want to do a pattern within that triangle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pattern stencil and I'm going to put it underneath, find the way that I want the pattern to go within the triangle. See how I want it to go. And actually I think I'm going to do it on this big one because I like the pattern and I want to put it inside this big triangle. So you put the pattern stencil underneath. You're going to put this stencil back over the top again, like that. And now I'm going to take a darker paint and I'm going to hold this down nice and firm. I'm using just a regular cosmetic sponge on the flat end. And I'm going to do that pattern. You kind of have to hold both stencil really firm. So what you're going to end up with is still the shape of your triangle with the base color. And when you remove them, you have a pattern within a pattern. And maybe you're asking, you know, why do I have to layer those stencils? Well, you don't, but if you were to just put that pattern down and take your cosmetic sponge and try to go within that, I guarantee you're going to go outside the edges. So using your stencil, putting it back down, keeping the form of your original shapes is the best way to go. Now I'm going to take another stencil. And I'm going to add a second pattern to this. So again, I'm going to slip this underneath, put that stencil right where I want it, get my third color of paint that I'm going to use, and go ahead and do my stenciling. These swirl stencils, they're hard to keep them flat on the paper, because that middle cutout piece always tends to pop up and you can't really hold it down flat. So I just make sure that I don't have too much paint on my sponge so that I don't go underneath that stencil, if that makes sense. Okay, so now when I lift it up, look how cool that is. So you've got your background color with texture, and you have two stencils within that diamond. Pretty fun. Okay, so I'm coming along with my patterns. I'm going to keep working on that. And now for the next page, for the next side, what I want to do is take my same stencil, and I'm putting it on a file folder, and I'm going to trace out these diamonds and cut them all out. Okay, so what I want to do is on this side of the page, I'm going to put my template down, and I'm going to do it exactly the same way. And you know, instead of putting it in a different spot, what I'm going for is this pattern exactly over here, but opposite. So what I did is I've cut out all these pieces out of file folder, which makes them reusable because they'll be nice and sturdy. And I'm going to use a Tombow Mono liquid glue. This glue can be used as movable or removable glue. So what I want to do is, where this is going to go, I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to put just a little bit of glue in a couple places, and that is going to be just to hold this glue or hold this piece in place. And I'm going to let it dry. That's what makes it removable, is if you dry it on the piece. So I'm going to do that to each piece. Just put a couple of dots for holding them in place, let them dry, and then once they do, they'll be ready to put onto the page. So I've applied my glue, and now I'm just going to wait for it to dry on the little file folder pieces. Okay, so now my glue is dry. You can't see it. It dries clear and it's just tacky. It's removable. So I'm going to put my stencil in place, And I'm going to put these where they're going to go. So I'm kind of just filling in that stencil back. And what I've done essentially is just made masks. So I'm covering in those places. With my masks. And now I'm going to remove the stencil. Carefully. And leave the masks in place. Okay. So now this pattern matches this pattern over here. Now I'm going to take some blue painter's tape and I'm just going to put it down this edge because I don't want my paint to get onto the other side. And I'm just going to lightly put that down, protect that little page there. And now I'm going to take my cosmetic sponge with this base color to match, and I'm going to fill in this entire area, this entire background. So I'm just making sure that I push down on my little mat when I'm going up next to it so that the paint doesn't creep underneath. And I could use that round cosmetic sponge again to make that same round texture, but it doesn't really matter, and I grabbed this. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and paint this whole background. Okay, so there is my background painted, and I'm leaving my mats still on, and now I'm going to put a stencil over some stencils and do some stenciling while that mat is still in place, or while those masks are still in place. I'm going to do some background stenciling. So what I'm doing is kind of the opposite of what I did over here. Same patterns, and same colors, just they're going to be in the background instead of in the triangles. Okay, so I'm going to play around with that and play around with the same stencils that I used, and before I take off these masks, I'm going to finish my entire background with stenciling. And I'm going to layer several different stencils over each other like I did over here. Okay, so I've put my stencils in the background and done, I think, what I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully remove my painter's tape that kept my page safe, and then carefully remove my masks. And I'm going to keep these. I'm going to just put these in a plastic bag and put them with that stencil, because I could do this same thing over again another time. So here you're starting to see, once I remove these, and they pop off nice and easy because that Tombow glue is removable or repositionable. And so look what I have. I have this cool layout. I haven't finished these, but just for video's sake, here's my cool layout with same pattern, but background and inside the diamonds. So I hope that was a fun thing for you to see, something different with a stencil and layering stencils in a different way. And now I'm going to just take a stencil, one stencil, and a bunch of different products, and just, if you're interested in seeing what different products look like through the same stencil, that's what I'm going to show next, just real quick like. Okay, here's a background I did on a page a while back, and it's watercolor. It's just random watercolors, and it's dried. I did it a long time ago. I'm going to take this stencil that has some feathers, and I'd like to add just some really cool random feather designs onto this page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some pigmented ink. For any kind of embossing, you need a pigment and ink. Pigment ink, I have another video on different inks and how to use them. Pigment ink is very wet. It has to be heat set, and you can either use it just plain and heat set it, or you can use it with embossing powder. So what I'm going to do here is let me zoom in a little, is to take my ink pad. I've got it face up so it's nice and tight to the page. I'm using my pigment ink, and I'm going to go in here and use my stencil, use my ink in between that, and put down a really nice even layer, as even as I can get it, of ink through the stencil. I was hoping that this ink pad would be juicy enough, and it is. You don't want it so juicy that it seeps underneath the stencil, but you want it to be wet enough so that it gets a nice layer of pigment ink so that my embossing powder will stick. Because what I'm going to do next is to emboss this image. Okay, I hopefully have done a good job of, oh yes, okay. So now what I'm going to do, I've got it inked, and while it's still wet, I'm going to take some black embossing powder. I think this is black, actually it could be a navy blue, and I'm going to sprinkle that over my image. And then I've got my little tidy tray here, so I'm gonna tap that off and see how the ink, it's left behind. Okay, so now I'm gonna take my heat tool and I'm going to heat this up. So this is a way of using your stencils instead of a rubber stamp. You're using your stencils to do embossing. Most people don't think of this. They think of using your rubber stamps to stamp the image and do the same thing. You do your embossing powder, but you don't think of using a stencil, and why not? As long as you put that ink through a stencil and get a good crisp image that you can add your embossing powder to, it's the same concept. So you want to heat it up, and as you do, hopefully you're seeing this. The embossing powder melts. You don't want to hold your heat tool so close that you burn your paper. But you just kind of watch it as it changes and becomes from a powder to a shiny. And now look what I have, this beautiful embossed leaf. Isn't that pretty? And it's immediately okay to touch. It's raised, it's embossed. That is gorgeous over my watercolor background. So there's another way of using your stencils. Use a pigmented ink over them and an embossing powder, and then heat set it to melt the embossing powder. If you wanted to do this in white, say you wanted to do white feathers and you have white embossing powder, you need to be sure and use a light colored ink like a white ink, because you can't, the white embossing powder doesn't hide the ink underneath, only the black does. So just be careful with that. If you have white embossing powder, use a white ink, and then you'll get a really nice white feather image. And the cool thing about having a little tidy tray is I can just dump that embossing powder back into my little plastic bag. I keep my embossing powders in little plastic bags, the little bead bags. You get 100 of them. You can buy them at Walmart, and you get 100 of them for only, I think, $2. So that's what I keep mine in, and usually I label on it what brand it is and what it is, like it's Black Ultra Fine and it's Ranger or whatever. This particular one I didn't know what it was, and I just put it in this bag. But anyway, that's what I do with my little tidy tray and my plastic bags for storing my embossing powder. And since we're talking stencils, for cleaning stencils, most people hate cleaning their stencils. I get this LA's Totally Awesome at the dollar store. It comes in this pump spray bottle. I take half of it out and fill the rest with water. This is what I use to clean my stencils. I take my plastic stencil to the sink, I mist this on, I wait a few seconds, and it doesn't matter if it's ink or paint, or I just use pigment ink and that came off. I've used dye ink, anything, and it just the stencils basically just rinse right clean. You just have to use your hand a little bit to rub it off, but easy peasy to clean your stencils with this. LA is totally awesome. Degreaser, spot remover, all-purpose cleaner. So dollar store, I know I sound like a broken record about the dollar store, but hey, the dollar store is an artist's friend, and this stuff works great. Also works good for if you have a paintbrush that you're trying to get paint and mediums and things out of. Just spray the bristles and work your fingers through those bristles, rinse it really good, and it works great. So for cleaning your stencils, this stuff is the bomb. Okay, so I'm going to use an Andy Skinner stencil, and I'm demonstrating this on some mixed media paper, but I just wanted to show you using one stencil but a bunch of different products, what the products look like through a stencil. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show is using pan pastels through a stencil, and I'm using just a stencil brush, and I'm just going to pick up some color on my brush and then use this over my stencil just to show you what pan pastels look like. And you can blend colors. Let's add some green in there. So there is pan pastel, which is really fun to use with a stencil. Look at that. That is so pretty. I love pan pastels. And then you do have to set this, pastels and chalks and things like that, you do have to set them with a fixative spray or they will smear. So when you were done, if that were your background on your page, you'd want to take some fixative spray and lightly mist it outside, let it dry completely, and then this background won't move or smear. And same thing with chalks. Here's a set of chalks, and let me show you the difference. Chalks, I think, are a little bit lighter than pan pastels. You do them in the same way. And as you can see, they're blendable, and it's pretty. It's not quite as bright. There's chalks. Chalks are a little bit lighter than a pan pastel. Pan pastel has a lot of pigment in it, so it stays very vibrant. And again, you would want to spray a fixative over a chalk. Okay, next I'm going to show some Tim Holtz Distress inks through the same stencil. And I'm using the blender tool, just picking up some ink and going over the stencil. I'm using peeled paint and blueprint sketch. And that's what distress ink looks like. And that will dry and it'll be permanent. Next I'm going to use some Caran d'Ache Neo Color 2 crayons. I'm using 2 colors and a piece of glass. And I'm going to just put those colors down on glass, activate them with a little bit of water, and use a cosmetic sponge. And then you can use your Neo colors to stamp over a stencil. Bet you didn't figure that one out. That's the fun part of your art mediums. If you just get in there and play around them and see what you can do with them, opens up a whole new world. So look at this. This is Caran d'Ache Neo Color crayons through a stencil. Look how beautiful that is. That's gorgeous. Love it. Okay, you can use your ink sprays. These are Dilutions ink sprays. And that's what they look like through a stencil, which is beautiful. And you can layer more colors. I'm just showing you a basic how to use them. And that Totally Awesome spray cleans dilutions inks off your stencils really well too. And of course we have acrylic paint. Just about all of us, I think, have seen or tried acrylic paint through a stencil. And how about our acrylic paint sprays? Let's try that. That didn't come out quite as clean and neat, but it's very grungy and I like the look of it. I like that grunge look. I was cleaning my stencil and made a little imprint there. That was on the back side of the stencil as I was cleaning it, and I just had to push it down and see what I get. So again, it's just playing. It's playing with your products and seeing what they will do. So this one here is Pan Pastel, which I really love the look of that. And this one is Chalk. And this one's acrylic paint. And this is Distress ink. And this is Dilution spray. And this is acrylic spray. And this is Caran d'Ache Neocolors. So there's many different looks, many different results using the same stencil but different products. So anyway, I hope this video was fun for you. I hope that you enjoyed the techniques that I showed with doing embossing through a stencil and using your stencil to layer with several different stencils at a time, using several different stencils at one time, and then using your stencil to make a mask, to make a opposites attract kind of a page. So hopefully this was fun and you learned something new and had a good time. So go play around with your art supplies, go love on your stencils, and see what you can create today. Art soothes the heart. Thanks for stopping by.